Have you ever hosted or attended a meal where things went seriously wrong? Meals are not just a chance to refuel, they're occasions for friendship and building relationships, for networking and making connections, and of course for enjoyment of good food and good company. The meal we're discussing today didn't appear to have much attachment attached. It seems to have been a rather grim event, titled in many translations as the Six Woes. We're not even sure that they actually ended up having a meal. We read the story in Luke 11, verses 37 through 54. Here's what happens. Jesus has just demonstrated his power through miracles, and people came to see what's going on. As the crowds increased, Jesus talked about lighting lamps and about how the eye is the lamp of the body. He tells them, when your eyes are good, your whole body also is full of light, but when they are bad, your body is also full of darkness. This is not one of the simplest stories Jesus has told. At that time, some people thought that our eyes actually emitted light that bounced back from what we're looking at to let us see the subject. I think, though, that Jesus was saying something about how we should live rather than about how eyesight works. When Jesus finished, one of the Pharisees in the crowd invited Jesus in to eat with him. We don't know why. We do know that some Pharisees believed in and followed Jesus. Please don't automatically assume that Pharisee equals bad. There were other Pharisees who definitely did not like Jesus, and this account ends with a group of Pharisees and teachers of the law opposing Jesus fiercely and besieging him with questions. We don't know the motivation of this Pharisee. He may have just wanted to ask Jesus, what did you mean by saying that our eyes are the lamp of the body? The text doesn't make it clear whether he was hostile or friendly. Later events simply imply that he was, or at least became, hostile. Jesus went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table, ready to eat. He skipped doing something that the Pharisees and others did before eating. He did not wash before the meal. You need to know that the word used here indicates a pour-over rinse rather than immersion or thorough cleansing. This ritual, as practiced in that day, symbolized cleanliness. You were not actually washing your hands, but proclaiming that they were clean. In any case, Jesus did not conform to the standard the Pharisees thought normal. And in case you're wondering, this was not commanded by God in his instructions to Israel in what we call the Old Testament. This was one of the rules added on by the religious leaders. Our passage says that the host, a Pharisee, noticed and was surprised that Jesus didn't do the ritual. Every culture has its rituals, some really important, others not so much. You know, as boulets trying to learn a new culture, my wife and I will probably make mistakes. Please help us and be friendly advisors so that we don't have to keep making mistakes, especially the important ones. Well, we don't know what words were used here to show surprise or whether it was just a look of astonishment. The language used later on between Jesus and the Pharisee implies that they were on a common social level and that Jesus was expected to know what to do. Ignorance of the culture wasn't the issue here. Jesus was not a newly arrived boule. The Pharisee was pointing out his guest's mistake, and probably in an unfriendly way. Now, remember, this is not about actually being clean. It's about performing a ritual that says, I'm cleaner than you. Jesus responded to this criticism by launching into criticisms or observations of his own, 6 of which are introduced with, Woe to you! We'll talk more later about the word woe. It has a meaning that's closer to alas than bad boy. Jesus is expressing regret with these criticisms, not simply pointing out flaws. He's like the doctor friend who notices something wrong and says to you, you really should get that checked out. Not to embarrass you, but because he or she wants to help keep you alive. The first criticism sets the stage for the others. It forms an umbrella that unites the following woes with the previous discussion on good and bad eyes. As in other stories, Jesus insists that what's inside us is important because it affects what's outside. Jesus accuses his audience, you Pharisees, of being clean outside but full of greed and wickedness on the inside. By the way, a rather strange idea back then came from the school of Shammai, who was a famous rabbi. He taught that cleaning the outside of the dish was what was important. The inside of the bowl could be dusty and dirty as long as the outside was clean. Of course, you and I would disagree with this, as did some of the other rabbis. For most of us, the inner cleanliness of a vessel is the big deal. I promise that if you come to our house, the inside as well as the outside will be clean. Well, the first woe is this. The Pharisees tithed on their herbs and spices, but didn't really care for others. It was 9 grains of salt for me, 1 for God, and who cares about anybody else? Mark observes in his parallel story in Mark chapter 7 that the Pharisees helped people to avoid taking care of their aged parents, and Jesus is very forceful. You should tithe, but you also need to pay attention to justice and showing God's love, taking care of others. Do more than just wash the outside the bowl. The second woe relates to insisting on the place of honor in public. Pride was a problem for these religious leaders. They wanted to be noticed. They wanted to be important. And the third woe is a direct insult. He labels the Pharisees as unmarked graves being stepped on by people who don't even know it. They are defiling others without offering a fair warning that this is happening. There were other people at the dinner, including some experts in the law. They were ones who added rules and enforced the laws. And one of them spoke up and challenged Jesus. He said, "Teacher, when you say these things, you insult us also." I bet he wished he hadn't spoken, because Jesus then turned his attention to him and his colleagues. Jesus speaks the next 3 woes to the lawyers, and these will actually parallel the ones to the religious leaders. Now, remember, Jesus expresses regret more than criticism with the word woe, but the audience clearly took this as an insult. The fourth woe is to lawyers who put burdens on the people that the people simply cannot carry. There's no intention of social justice and mercy. They don't want to help the people, just load them down. They made bizarre rules and interpretations of rules. For instance, on the Sabbath, a man may not carry a burden in his right hand or in his left hand, in his bosom or on his shoulder, but he may carry it on the back of his hand, or with his foot, or with his mouth, or with his elbow, or in his ear, or in his hair, or in his wallet if it is carried mouth downward, or between his wallet and shirt, or in the hem of his shirt, or in his shoes or sandals? Come on, give me a break. The lawyers actually considered an offense against their interpretation of the law a more serious issue than breaking the law itself. The fifth woe points out that they seek honor while acting dishonorably. Their group had hypocritically killed the prophets, and then they erected tombs and memorials to commemorate those same prophets, as if doing so removed their guilt. Morris says, it is always easier to honor dead saints than living ones. And as Nolan points out, they were in effect celebrating the successful extermination of the prophet. Like the Pharisees, the lawyers were controlled by their pride, wanted to look good in public. The cup was dirty inside, but the outside was shiny, as if that's what mattered. The sixth warning comes because the leaders withhold true knowledge from those they are supposed to be teaching. Just as the religious leaders are unmarked graves, desperately unclean, the legal experts here have embraced not true knowledge, but even worse, they've stopped others from entering into knowledge. So, having delivered these bombshells, Jesus left. Some call this an after-dinner speech. As I read the story, it seems doubtful that they actually ate a meal. A meal wouldn't make you feel great about yourself as a host. It wasn't a resounding success. Now, we do know that religious discussions in Jesus' time were pretty open and direct, so it may have not seemed as harsh to them, but apparently, including the host, they certainly took offense. But remember, with the word woe, Jesus is actually saying alas. He's inviting his hearers to do something about their state. Think of this word as the flip side of the word blessed, which we know from the Beatitudes. Those who were blessed are fortunate even though their external state may seem desperate. Those to whom Jesus says woe or alas are actually significantly at risk, even if their external state may seem calm and admirable. Unfortunately, following this encounter, the religious leaders and the teachers of the law put all their energy into trying to trap Jesus with tricky questions. They missed the message. If you have a dinner at your house with a medical expert as a guest of honor, what would you do if he said to you, "You really should get yourself checked out? I observed a symptom that could be deadly. I believe that quick action could fix it entirely." If you're wise, you'll listen to the warning. If you're foolish, you'll do what the Pharisees and lawyers did and try to discredit the expert. You know what? Reading this story and saying, "Tisk, tisk, look at those nasty Pharisees," tempts us to become like them. If we look at how bad others are and compare that to the how clean the outside of our bowl is, we've done just what these people did. Jesus challenges them and us to get clean from the outside in. That's something that only he can do. In an evening conversation with a guy called Nicodemus, he talked about being born again, of starting over. Nicodemus tried to figure out how he could do that. Jesus says, "Oh, no, that's not something you can do for yourself. That rebirth happens through the Spirit of God." Getting cleaned up involves at least two things. First, no matter how good the outside looks, we need help on the inside. We must recognize ourselves as unmarked graves and ignorant teachers, depending on our own power. Secondly, once we identify our problem, we must let the Holy Spirit do His work in our lives. One of the dangers about places like church or life groups is that we try to get cleaned up before we show up. When we look at each other, everyone may seem perfect and the reality is otherwise. We try to behave nicely, but we know that we're broken and imperfect. We don't want to admit it to others. Jesus holds up his hand as we walk by and says, "Wait a minute. I want to enter the flow of your life. By the way, it's not going as well as you want others to think. What you can't do for yourself, purifying the real you, Jesus invites you to allow the Holy Spirit to do for you. And that is real refreshment."